My name is Matthew Continetti, and I am the Director of Domestic Policy Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our discussion tonight of the new illiberalism, the American media and the future of democracy. One of the major problems we face in American life today is the decline of trust in institutions. And this trend is particularly evident in American views of established media outlets. And I believe most of its cause of this distrust is fairly clear. For years now, major media institutions have blurred the distinction between news and opinion, substituting the ideas and attitudes of a small percentage of the population for objective reporting and fair-minded analysis. The rise of the internet and of social media in particular has made the problem worse. Today, journalism is driven by tribal affiliation and an insatiable demand for clicks. In such a polarized climate, journalists have come to see themselves not as writers, researchers, or information gatherers, but as advocates for the latest iteration of social justice. Last December, James Bennet, the Economist's Lexington columnist, published a groundbreaking essay casting these disturbing trends in a new light. Bennet had been the editorial page editor of the New York Times from 2016 until June 2020, when he was forced to resign at the height of what can only be described as a cultural revolution in American life. At the time, America had been consumed by riots and protests over the death of George Floyd. In response, the Times published a range of op-eds, some of them encouraging the protests, one calling for the abolition of the police. But the internal reaction to another op-ed, written by Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton, would be a wake-up call for supporters of free and open debate. In the piece, entitled "Send in the Troops," Senator Cotton argued that U.S. military personnel should be deployed to American cities to quell the violent uprising, just as President George H.W. Bush had done in the riots that erupted in Los Angeles in 1992 after police officers were acquitted in the beating of Rodney King. Reporters and staff members at the Times took to Slack and to Twitter to express their outrage that the paper had dared to publish an opinion with which they disagreed. They claimed that publishing the op-ed threatened their safety. The outrage grew. Less than 3 days later, James Bennet was forced to resign. In his Economist piece, When the New York Times Lost Its Way, Bennet explores how this episode was another example of the drift of media away from the values of pluralism, political neutrality, and ideological balance. He examines how the Times became defined by an intellectual monoculture, intolerant of dissent and afraid to trust its readers with alternative perspectives. As James Bennet writes in his essay, quote, "Journalism, like democracy, works best when people refuse to surrender to fear." We're here this evening, then, not simply to describe how American journalism, or parts of it, large parts of it, has succumbed to illiberalism, but also to analyze the growth of illiberalism throughout Americans' opinion-forming institutions more broadly, including higher education in the wake of the October 7th attack on Israel. Leading the discussion tonight will be the distinguished journalist Charles Lane, a deputy opinion editor and columnist at the Washington Post and the author of 3 books on American history and legal affairs. He will be joined by AEI non-resident fellow Thomas Chatterton Williams, a staff writer at the Atlantic whose next book, Nothing Was the Same, will reflect on the events of 2020 and explore their meaning for America's future. And we are also happy to welcome to the stage Eliana Johnson, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon and co-host with AEI's Chris Steyerwalt of the Ink-Stained Wretches podcast. We hope to have some time toward the end of the discussion for audience Q&A. And if you're watching online, please submit any questions you may have to guy.denton, D-E-N-T-O-N, at aei.org, or send a question via Twitter using the hashtag #NewIlliberalism. And with that, I am happy to turn things over to Charles Lane of the Washington Post.
Very much, Matthew. I'm very excited to be here with this distinguished panel in front of such a pretty good-sized crowd for an event of this nature. Just wanted to make a couple of quick remarks about the framing of this event, which is the new illiberalism. It's kind of, when you think about it, maybe 20 years ago at an AEI forum about the New York Times, they would have just been complaining about the old liberalism. But that, I think, is an interesting comment about our situation. We're not talking about a newspaper that stands accused of being pro-liberal. And we're not talking about a newspaper that's non-liberal or anti-liberal. We're talking about the notion of illiberalism, which is kind of a different animal. And that's going to be what we kind of circle around as we discuss things. Matt alluded to this sensational article that James produced for The Economist. It's one of the most provocative, eloquent things I've read in a long time. Whether you agree or disagree with what he said, you have to admire the fact that you're definitely reading the words of somebody who's saying, perhaps at long last, what he really thinks. And that's always an admirable thing. So that makes this particularly special occasion, at least for me. And then the idea that we're going to talk about it with two colleagues who have a lot to say on the same subject is also really gratifying. So what I'm going to do is start off by asking you, James, a question. I went back and reread the piece and took a lot of quotes from it. There's a lot of quotable material. But I wanted to kick us off, not so much talking about the incident involving the Tom Cotton op-ed, but maybe the most frequently quoted line in your article. Quote, "The reality is that the Times," meaning the New York Times, "is becoming the publication through which America's progressive elite talks to itself about an America that does not really exist." Close quote. Tell us what you meant by that and how that experience with the Cotton op-ed prompted you to formulate that thought.
Well, thank you, Chuck. Matt, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you for convening us. It's an honor to be here at AI and to be here with you guys on this panel. I mean, I arrived at that conclusion from hard experience about being back at the New York Times. I spent most of I was there as a reporter for 15 years, gone for 10 as editor of The Atlantic, and I went back for 4 years as the opinion editor and discovered, in my view, that the Times had changed radically in culturally in the intervening 10 years. And these are changes, as Matt was saying, that we've seen, I think, ripple through journalism more broadly, throughout American journalism. And what I saw was, what I believe I saw was trends that were exacerbated, as so much has been by the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Reporters retreating to the same kind of filter bubbles that readers are so easily able to cocoon themselves in now, and becoming as susceptible to the peer pressure that's exerted in social media by their chosen tribes as anybody else. And the old rewards, and again, the risk of sounding like an old crank or an old guy. The old rewards for being contrarian, heterodox, challenging conventional wisdom, I believe have been replaced. And again, my story and my experience was about the New York Times. I think this is a much bigger problem and much broader than that. Those had been replaced by a compulsion, and again, for very understandable reasons, not for reasons of bad faith, not for reasons of evil on anybody's part, but the incentives created by the media ecosystem in which we now live had been replaced by a desire to conform and to say what other people were saying and to ratify the view of the tribe. And we can go into, again, I think so much of this is related to the rise of the internet, reporting in the virtual world as opposed to reporting out in the world, and encountering other Americans in all their complexity and reckoning with the essential decency and intelligence of your fellow Americans by reporting out in the field. There are fewer and fewer journalists, partly because of the economics of the business, who can do that kind of work. And so the journalists who are supposed to be the best listeners in the society, I think, are instead not hearing, either on the right or the left, what people who don't see the world the way they do are saying. That's a bit of a rambling answer to the question, but those
I want to call on our other two panelists in a second, but let me just follow up. So if this is the progressive elite talking to itself about an America that does not really exist, describe that America that they're talking about. In other words, you say it doesn't really exist, but what is this fiction that they are discussing?
I mean, I don't want to, there's no way to do this without simplifying, oversimplifying, but it's an America in which every Republican is a rabid MAGA Republican who is cheering on every most kind of unsettling or transgressive element of Donald Trump's movement. I mean, that's a very simple kind of statement about it, but it's also in America, and again, this is where there's the old problem of liberalism that the New York Times have struggled with for generations, and I certainly, and I come from that. I consider myself of the left, although not with a capital L. Come from that background that's now overlaid with a new problem, and a much more serious one, I think, of illiberalism. But it's, you know, it's a very much a coastal reality. It's a reality that's not terribly interested in what's going on in the middle of the country. And again, it's increasingly one that's interested in what's happening on the internet. I don't think we really realize how much coverage of the internet and a sense of what's real is what's happening on the internet has replaced kind of coverage out there in the real world. And that has been something that's been very easy for politicians to exploit, manipulate.
Thomas Chatterton Williams, I want to ask you for a quick reaction to what you've just heard.
I really, I couldn't agree more with James's assessment. And when he published the piece, I had actually just at the same time, by chance, we met each other around that the day before your piece came out, and I got a chance to read it after we had lunch and talked. But I had been thinking about what happened at the New York Times quite a lot. I was a contributing writer at the magazine at that same time, and it was really, it wasn't only what happened at op-ed with James, but that was a major impetus for some other writers and myself to start talking to each other and drafting this letter on free expression and open debate that ended up running in Harper's Magazine, an open letter signed by a lot of other writers, just trying to make the basic case that there really is a kind of both formal and informal culture of censoriousness that was really constricting people's ability to think and disagree in good faith freely within institutions, not just in the media, but prominently in the media. So, you know, what happened to James, I think, actually, in retrospect, as I've been writing my book about this era, was really emblematic of much larger cultural shifts. And I think you're kind of, you were scapegoated in a way that I think is a lens through understanding so much of what's plaguing our institutions.
Well, Eliana Johnson, as a conservative, this must be just great, like total vindication. This is what I've always thought about the media, or is it? Or do you find yourself contemplating this these thoughts of James's more in sorrow than in vindication? Not to lead the question too much.
You know, a little bit of both. It's bad for the country, so I can't be too happy about it. But I think I have less compunction about describing the world that James alluded to in his piece. And I think it's one that we see playing out on college campuses now. Matt alluded to that in his introduction, where broadly speaking, and again, it is broadly speaking, but where words are violence and at times actual violence is justified as resistance, where disagreements on one side are slapped with the label of conspiracy theories, where the terms racist and bigot are thrown around casually and attached to those with whom one disagrees. And I think the result of that has been, and I think of COVID, this comes to mind, where the Times ran pieces, and again, this comes back to Senator Tom Cotton, labeling the view that this may have come from a lab as a conspiracy theory. What I have seen is the result of this is that it has increased distrust for a lot of the country in elite institutions. And that may be good, it may be bad. I tend to think it's bad because it's increasing the distance between Americans in the middle of the country and Americans on the coast. And now they can rightfully say, these people are lying to us. They have no idea what they're talking about. Oh, and the term misinformation and disinformation is thrown around totally casually as a substitute for real argument. What I will say from my vantage point as a conservative who has worked in the mainstream and done real reporting is I've really seen institutions like the Times, the Post, the Journal cede huge ground to conservative media. And I don't know if they're aware of what they're doing because they are not covering the biggest stories that are happening in the country. The Times has picked up a little bit on stories involving transgender medicine or the treatment of transgender young people. But what's happening on college campuses, in many cases, conservative media or independent media has led the charge on that. That has to be one of the biggest stories in the country. And in most cases, the mainstream media has followed rather than led on that. And these are places whose resources dwarf ours. We're a tiny little place. So I just think they're leaving huge stories and huge white spaces uncovered. And yeah, there are places to pick them up, but on the whole, it has to be bad, that there are enormous stories. I could list 10 more that are not being covered the way they should be.
Well, I want to, without going too far over into academia, I want to come back to journalism and some of the things that James raised in his piece. I thought one of the points that you emphasized that I thought was very astute, James, was the kind of ethos that young people are bringing to careers in journalism when they start out now. I mean, I became a journalist because I couldn't face law school. So I'm a little bit of an outlier. I don't know, maybe I'm typical, I don't know. But if you ask me why I went off and became a journalist, I would say it was probably more to see the world than to change the world, right? I think those are kind of the two reasons people become journalists. But part of what I was brought up in, and I think you were too, was the idea that it was sort of a little bit of a priesthood. That the trade-off you got for all that access to exciting personalities, information, and experiences was that you stood apart from the actual conflict you were causing. And you referred to that, I think, as renouncing the taking of sides. Tell us a little bit about why you think that ethos disappeared, and what, if anything, could be done to rebuild it?
Yeah, and let me slip in the caveat quickly that because it needs to be recognized, there are lots of people at the New York Times doing really great work, yeah. and there are lots of people at the New York too. And at the Post, and there are lots of people taking real physical risks in places like Ukraine to report stories. And I wrote this piece in an effort to support that.
Yeah.
And also what I think is, some efforts underway at a counter-revolution, efforts that I don't think are as bold or aggressive as they ought to be, but that are, as Eliana referred to, there's some signs of that. And Chuck, it was the same for me as a journalist. I mean, my experience was so often to be fortunate to be dropped into beats where I was kind of starting over and learning and having the humbling experience of coming to grips constantly with how much I didn't know about the world. And the great privilege part of the privilege of being a journalist really is the whole world is your school. You kind of never stop learning. You never stop and you have a license to ask people about anything. Often it can get on their nerves, but it's that to me was the glory of it. And then the other thing was that you never had to pretend the world was less complicated than it actually is. Obviously, the work of journalism is also a work of simplification and explication, but you didn't have to take a position, and you never had to tell a lie. You did your best to represent the world as it is, and that to me was the trade-off. You didn't have the satisfaction of being an activist and being able to be out there on the front lines fighting for change. But if you were somebody like me who wasn't all that confident of your own opinions to begin with, and endlessly fascinated by what other people thought and how they came to those conclusions about the world, and you liked being able to write letters home, which is the way I always thought about my stories, about what you were learning, boy, it was just a wonderful profession. And I think it changed, as so much did, and very much grounded as a result in what I've always thought of as fundamental tenets of liberalism. It changed as the internet knocked the economic foundations out from under the business, as people could afford to do less reporting in the real world, as they spent more time reporting on the internet, as local journals disappeared, as people retreated to their cocoons, and like so many else, as liberalism failed to live up to its own stated principles in journalism, as I think it failed elsewhere in the world. I mean, when I got to the New York Times opinion section, for example, there were 11 columnists, and one of them was a person of color. 2 out of 11 were women, and 2 out of 11 were conservatives. So I'm now trying to make the case for a diversity of views that for me included bringing more conservatives into the New York Times. And rightly, people could look at me and just say, you're a friggin' hypocrite, because for years, what were you guys doing? Like you care about it now? Well, what about when we weren't being heard? And that's a fair complaint. And there were other fair, I'm trying to give some sense for these views didn't come from nowhere, and I think we have to reckon with our own responsibility for the period in which we weren't necessarily fully delivering on our own kind of ambitions or aspirations for what a truly kind of broad diversity of opinion should look like.
Well, Thomas, let me ask you the question this way. If you wanted to create a news organization or a magazine or an institution that was devoted to what James and I are idealizing as the right way to do journalism, do you think you could find people who are interested in doing that? Where would you go to get them?
Yes, yes, I do. There are so many people, I think, even already within the organizations who, when we were, at that moment in time, I was just thinking as James was talking, so many people at the Times specifically didn't agree with what was happening, but there's just a sense that you couldn't publicly voice what you actually think. And I think the first thing you would do if you wanted to cultivate that type of an environment would be to make people feel that they had the ability to speak forthrightly and honestly and disagree with each other without fear of compromising their livelihoods. So that would be a cultural change that would find diversity of viewpoints within institutions already. But then I think there would also have to be a kind of commitment to a different understanding of what diversity actually is. I think we often get far too hung up on what looks superficially like diversity, but actually is just mono-thought packaged in slightly different casings. having a bunch of people from the same 3 schools that are of the same socioeconomic class, but some of them are of slightly different ethnic and gender and sexual orientation backgrounds is not what I would consider actual diversity. So I think there would have to be kind of efforts to reimagine how you locate different types of writers and how you empower them to speak on behalf of communities. Because I think the other thing is that there's an understanding that, I mean, I know for a fact, just as somebody of African descent in this country, that there's quite a lot of diversity within Black thought, but there's a kind of a narrow idea of who speaks on behalf of the group. And so I think, to come back to what James was talking about, when you're just covering, when you're commenting on commentary, you have this idea that, you know, there's one sense of what like moral clarity means to the Black community, but it's actually a very narrow slice of the Black community that has conversations like abolishing the police, for example. And if you actually had a different understanding of who can speak on behalf of the group, you'd be surprised by what kind of ideas you would get in response to a proposition like getting rid of police forces in communities where people are actually confronted with high levels of crime and violence. There's much more conversation going on than we have a sense of when we cover the commentary itself, if that makes sense.
So Eliana, we have already branded you, and you've accepted, I think, the label as the conservative editor here on the panel. But so I want to ask you this, like, do you feel any obligation to have liberals writing for you? Is that not part of the deal, or is what the Free Beacon is about is kind of just being, kind of embracing the idea that newspapers or websites, whatever, they just have an ideological orientation, and they should just sort of go with that? One reason I ask that is that I think that is both in our own history in the 19th century and in some other cultures, for example, Britain, the media culture is sort of more open about the political leanings of a media organization. Or, you know, do you think the Free Beacon ought to have, you know, a few progressives in there to, putting you on the spot, because I have, I'm sort of thinking like maybe my son, who's kind of progressive, could use a job. No, I'm just, that is a joke. That is a joke.
For your son?
Yeah, right.
We could make an exception. No, it's a great question, and I do think that we're moving toward an era, in part led by places like the Times, that are embracing, I think, just becoming ideologically liberal places, the Post, where there's room for lots of different ideological outlets. No, I don't feel like we have an obligation to have conservatives and liberals, but we do not, unlike the Times and the Post, we do not hold ourselves out as representative of all views and of you know, mainstream views. We say, like, we come from a center-right perspective, and our goal is to present people with new information that they would not find elsewhere. And that is the difference, I think, between the Beacon and what we see from the Times and the Post. And when I look at these other outlets, I think, like, I know what you guys are doing because we do it at the Beacon. We just don't brand ourselves as, you know, democracy dies in darkness, or this is the center of American opinion, and we're, you know, we're doing things right down the middle here. And that is what I think grinds the gears of conservatives, is to be told that this is neutral, when in reality it is a mix of opinion and reporting. I will say, increasingly, we have a Beacon reporter in the audience here, Aaron Sabarium, who, when I interviewed him, said, I'm not actually a conservative. And increasingly, there are kids who come to the Beacon, and in most cases, that's fine. Like, they want to write the stories we're interested in having written. There's usually no issue with that. There are certain principles that we're pretty clear about, that we're immovable on. We are, I would say, strident Zionists. But apart from that, like, pretty open.
Sounds like the old New Republic.
Yeah.
That's an inside joke, but I think
I would say, like, it has been quite interesting. I would say more and more kids will come and say, I'm not necessarily, I don't quite know what I am, but I do think that the monoculture at the mainstream outlets is pushing people who on the center or like who don't quite know where they are, but are curious, intellectually curious people into outlets that might brand themselves as conservative, but are just more tolerant of dissenting views. And I see this when I speak to college students. I spoke to a group of Yale college students in a conservative student group, and we went around the table and I asked them, like, how did you come to be a part of this group? Half the kids at the table said, I'm not actually a conservative. I just reject the monoculture on campus. And so I think more and more, this is, what I'm saying is that I think these, James, you wrote it, like these people are talking to themselves and excluding large segments of the public that say, I don't quite know what I am, but I don't want to be a part of that.
So James, I'm going to try a different version of this similar question on you. You go to great lengths in your argument, and the sincerity of it is almost overwhelming, pleading for sort of a return to the right way to do things, which you believe the New York Times once embraced and others once embraced, but have kind of drifted away from. What if that's irreversible? Is a second best solution for the media as a whole to have this kind of, you got the Free Beacon over here, you got the Post and the Times over here, you got, they'll be pretty openly ideological, or maybe they'll pretend they're not ideological or whatever, but they'll just kind of do battle. And the new challenge for the reader will be not what you posit, which is to look at this pretty objective thing and sort of figure out what you think for yourself, but to actually kind of referee among all these competing visions of reality.
Say that last bit again, that the journal's role would be to referee, or the reader would be?
Role.
Yeah, I think that's asking an awful lot of the reader. I think that is the world that we're moving towards and already living with. And as you said earlier, Chuck, it's very much like a 19th century version of what the media environment was like. And it may well be that in so many respects that 100-year or so period is the anomalous one, where we had the rise of the idea of objectivity in American journalism. The ambition to separate news and opinion and to create a kind of foundation of shared fact. And like so much in the media, in our reality and our definition of news, it was driven by changes in technology and changes in business model, right? We went from a kind of a niche industry serving everybody who could afford a printing press could basically reach a certain number of people. It became a mass industry. The basis for that mass industry was advertising. You didn't want to alienate, as Eliana was saying, a large swath of the audience. That was the business model supported the idea of objectivity and a reportorial core that would try to, they'd be conservatives, they'd be liberals, but they would try to set their ideology aside and deliver the news fairly. And at the same time, you'd have a robust kind of opinion section that was walled off where many viewpoints were represented. And that was the model that the New York Times was built on for a century, and it failed in many ways, and there were all sorts of problems with it, but I do think it created a foundation for a shared basis of fact in this country. And I don't know how the diversity of this country can be a source of strength rather than weakness if we don't have some agreement on what the basic facts of reality are. And that goes back to that one line you quoted me at the beginning, which I did a very bad job of explaining, Chuck, that I'm concerned about is, if people believe they're getting the truth, but in fact they're being served both a news report that's increasingly influenced by people's ideology and a range of debate that actually doesn't really reflect where the richness of debate is in this country, then they don't really understand what's happening out there in the world.
I mean, I think...
Can I say one more quick thing about
this?
Sorry, just to complete the thought about business model. I'm sorry, I can bang on about this stuff for too long. This is one of the dangers of the subscriber world that we've moved into, which I got wrong, like so much else I got wrong. I was so excited at the beginning as we moved from an advertiser-based model where everybody was pursuing scale on the internet. What better bulwark for the quality of your product can there be than having an individual pay you for it? The danger, obviously, is that the best way to retain the loyalty of your subscribers, to reassure them that you see the world exactly as they do, and you don't want to upset them. You don't want to confront them with confounding news they don't want to hear, like that, well, we can go into the list of things that they'd be upset about, but or with opinions that they would find objectionable.
Well, the newspaper would just be a slower moving TikTok, right? I mean, that, the algorithm of TikTok is instant in steering you down your rabbit hole. The newspaper would move a little slower. So, Thomas, I'd like to sort of get your reaction to this idea that maybe the second best solution is just let the liberal and the conservative media just slug it out, or is there something sort of illiberal about that? I mean, because our democracy was, I think by today's standards in the 19th century, was an illiberal democracy. There was a lot of restriction on the franchise, obviously. There was a narrow range of permitted opinion. There was a lot more political repression around the country. But in our current situation, would this sort of left-right open slugfest be okay with you?
I mean, I think James is right. That's the way the media landscape is now, to an extent. But I think that, there is something healthy in the kind of new media landscape. Like, we have members of the new media here in the audience, the Free Press and new organizations and Substacks are doing some kind of, I think, healthy critique of the larger institutions. And if you're tuned in to a variety of sources, you can kind of triangulate like good, healthy viewpoints on a variety of topics that you don't get from being served by one specific place. But I really agree with what James is saying, that's quite a lot to ask of. I mean, I work in the industry, and it's a lot for me to keep up with reading. And if I'm not involved in media, it seems like quite a lot to ask of the typical reader. So I think that that's one of the main dangers. But I do like the idea that you have much more. I mean, the activists have a point that you have more speech than you've ever had in the past. You're right. I mean, things were quite constricted in the past when we lived in this kind of this period that we now look back on with nostalgia. I think there's a lot of opportunity for having a much better and more vibrant discourse now. But we really do need institutions, and we really need our institutions to be trusted. And you can have a lot of value added by smaller independent Substacks and people doing quality questioning of the institutions, but if you don't have that basic trust in the mainstream, then that's a problem. One of the points that James made in his piece that was so, it articulated something that I understood, but it was really eye-opening how you phrased it. You said that basically the New York Times can't work like the Free Beacon. It can't be an openly partisan newspaper. The 10 million people that subscribe to it who lean liberal mostly, they pay for that because they believe that it is objective and neutral, and they wouldn't want to pay for it if it were openly partisan and liberal. So the whole thing is, right, it's functioning on this, on selling itself as this ideal.
I want Eliana, do your subscribers not think you're neutral? And I mean, in other words, do conservative papers depend on have a subscriber base that doesn't feel that way about the information the way Times subscribers feel about theirs? And I'm asking you that in part because I also want to know, from your point of view, if you had advice to the New York Times, and I mean sincere, non-snarky advice to the New York Times about how to fix its trust problem from the vantage point from where you stand, what advice would you give them?
Two separate questions. The first is that I don't think conservative readers of news have that same same kind of self-regard that they need to like think what they're reading is neutral. I think they want to know that it's true, and they read the New York Times and they think they see bias everywhere. And I think they read, you know, when they're reading the Beacon, like they find that a more reliable like version of truth. And the sort of like what grinds our gears is the bias in the reporting that never swings in the other direction. And the presentation, like the self-seriousness of the reporters, the idea that they think they're neutral. This just happened with like the NBC and Ronna Romney, like, you know, our Nicole Wallace going on the air and talking about their sacred airwaves and a badge-carrying member of NBC. I can assure you, okay, nobody on the Free Beacon staff is talking about our sacred web space and our badge at the Beacon and, oh, the honor, and we're not going to bestow it on anybody else. I mean, you know, we're not like saving lives here. Or not brain surgery, like, you know, just that kind of self-regard is so tiresome to us. And then I think the idea is like there are stories that the mainstream won't, of enormous interest to conservatives that the mainstream is not covering. The ones that come to mind are, you know, this Claudine Gay plagiarism story that the Beacon did, and then the reception to it, the Times and the Journal did pick that up. But then when you watch the coverage of it on cable news, it wasn't like, boy, yeah, that was bad. It was like, well, they only covered that because they don't like black women and they have a problem with black women in power, when like they can't really challenge the facts. First it was like, well, everybody does this, and you know, there's an argument over like whether this should have been reported at all.
Sounds like they were copying each other's coverage of the plagiarism. Yeah. So what's your advice to the mainstream media is just like don't be so full of yourselves?
Well, that's part of it, but I'm not quite sure that's fixable. That's like hiring a different sort of set of people. Yeah. But I think it's hiring a different set of people who have some sense from talking to people about like, what are the real stories in American life that people are interested in? Okay, like after 10/7, something is happening on college campuses. I can tell you from talking to people, like people are deeply interested in this story. Yeah. Okay, it's been happening for a long time. It is one of the biggest stories in the country. Like get out there, get onto campuses, talk to students. It's important. That's one. You know, what is happening with enormous private foundations? I've been having these conversations with a lot of people. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation. I've gone and searched, you know, in the Wall Street Journal, the Times. All you find is like glowing profiles of the heads of these foundations. They're very powerful, but I could come up with a list of 10 things that just don't get covered that are of interest to conservatives. And I don't think there's a sense at these big mainstream outlets that there's much of interest to people in the country, including the Biden administration, other than Trump and his, you know, criminal problems.
So, James, this picks up a little bit on what Eliana was just talking about. It's long been the case that journalists were self-important, pompous people. That's not really new, unfortunately. But just to give you an anecdote, I was in a meeting at the Post maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and we were talking about our social media presences, and I recommended to the group that everyone quit Twitter. And I based that on my personal experience, which was that it was my mental health, you know, ebbs and flows. But a very good moment for my mental health was when I quit Twitter. Suddenly I had more time on my hands. I was more relaxed. I wasn't worried about the thing pinging all the time. And furthermore, it was I wasn't having the waste of time away from real journalism. So I made that pitch to the group, and the intern spoke up and said, but Chuck, you already have a brand, which I didn't know, but I thought to myself, a brand? She said, yes, we younger journalists are still establishing our brands, and that's why we need Twitter. So talk to me about the part of your analysis that has to do with the sense young journalists have that this is a personal branding exercise for them.
Yeah, and this is why I say, and I was thinking about Eliana's list and thinking my first step would be get off social media. But I've had exactly that same conversation that you just described, Chuck. And this is why I say that it's not bad faith, it's just the incentives that exist. And to succeed in journalism, people feel like, first of all, like brand in this time, this is the kind of thing that in the old New York Times, you use the word brand and the head copy editor would circle it in your copy and say, this is the language of advertising. We do not use this language. And that's what an old crank I am. It still shocks me that we talk about ourselves this way in journalism, but we do. And I think it's terribly corrupting. I don't think it's malicious. I don't think they're wrong. It's their right to be worried about it. They need to build their presence in social media because they've seen other people get rewarded for building big followings on social media, and because they see that their bosses are scared of those people and they're not willing to stand up to them. And it's terribly destructive. And I think you kind of have to start over. Rebuilding your culture from the ground up. It's hard. It's hard work. But it's not impossible work. It's going to take some leadership. But you have to make people feel that they can succeed without having 1 million followers on Twitter. That they can be rewarded for doing work that challenges people's view of reality rather than simply reinforces it, and that they have an opportunity to grow within your institution over the long haul. And that's hard, but I think it's doable.
Thomas, I saw you nodding in vigorous agreement there. What was going through your mind?
All of us engaged in a kind of mass global psychological experiment over the past decade and change with these social media platforms, inside and outside of the media. We allowed ourselves to be experimented on. We now know much more than we knew several years ago, but we know that, certain journalists who are supposed to be actually reporting on and covering the news, it was a real mistake for them to become extraordinarily followed on Twitter and other platforms to the point where they're more followed than the publications they write for in certain instances, or more passionately followed. And so you actually have some people that were too big to keep in line with the goals and the objectives of the institution that when they veered apart from their own personal ambitions or biases. So we know that that's a mistake now, and it's hard to put that toothpaste back in the tube. But no one asked me, but if I were giving advice, I would get rid of things like Slack. That seems to be more trouble than it's worth. I would also, maybe this has already happened at the times. There have been changes, but I would have a policy that you can never make a decision based on something that happens, a blow up that happens online on social media for more than sooner than 48 hours. Because usually if you actually don't react immediately, these things are not substantial and they go away. But the girl that said that to you was correct. I think 5 years ago, Zadie Smith told me, get off of Twitter now. Why are you on Twitter? And I said, well, if I was as famous as you are, I wouldn't be on Twitter either. But you do have these incentives to have to make sure that you can survive if you're laid off at an institution, because these jobs are so precarious at a lot of these places now that you have to be able to take your work elsewhere. And so oftentimes if you have a large following on Twitter or elsewhere, that insulates you from some job insecurity. So one of the things that would make, I think, the culture healthier is if it were economically more viable for more people to have jobs that they could count on, and they could invest in the institution and believe they could grow there without believing that it's just their name and they live and die by that.
So Eliana, on a slightly different note, the big story of the last few days, obviously, well, at least obvious to me, was the collapse of the bridge in Baltimore. Terrible thing, but also, in a funny way, a real counterpoint to everything we're talking about. It was immediately clear, what had happened, right? The American public got immediately and accurately informed, almost in real time, that this major bridge had just collapsed because a boat ran into it, unfortunately. And I wonder if part of our problem is that events like that are now so effortlessly communicated accurately. That used to be like a big production for a newspaper reporter to get out to the Patapsco River and find a payphone to call that back to the news desk and convince people it was really happening. That there's the amount of time and energy we have to devote to just telling people what's going on is so small that we're filling it up with the elaboration and the commentary.
I want to say one thing about Twitter and social media really quick, because I have to admit, I don't totally understand it. I've never been a big social media person, and I don't quite understand the brand thing and how you separate somebody's brand from just they're really good and they do amazing work. And my guidance to reporters has always been like, you want a brand, like it's in breaking news and doing amazing work, and that will be your brand. And to the extent that people have a brand that's separate from that, I can think of a few where people do very little work but have high online presence, big online presences. Those are not brands that I would pay a salary for. So I don't totally understand that, like the distinction between like just do your work and keep your head down and like your brand will develop. And also like I thought that in reporting like this really wasn't supposed to be about us, and that like really that should be the guidance to people. Like over 40 years, like maybe it will become, maybe you will become known for like shedding light on what's happening out there in the world. But I do feel like this has just been toxic and distorting because Twitter rewards speed, snark, opinion. And that is like not, maybe speed, but it's speed to be snarky and opinionated, not to do the real, like this stuff takes time and is expensive, and it's just not what Twitter rewards. And by the way, like the feedback you get on there is from a distorted world that is not at all reflective of the real world. So I do think it's poisonous, and I think like often I feel wrong, and the reporters at the Beacon do not listen to me about this, but I still think I'm right. Still think I'm right.
So the heck with the bridge.
Okay, so the bridge. The bridge. I don't want to eat up too much time, but so it's totally true about the bridge. However, I think there are a lot of other stories that would take a lot of time and effort to get to the bottom of that aren't being covered. I can think of a lot of stories about the Biden White House that is opaque in many, many ways, particularly about how the president is managed. He's old. What is exactly? I still don't think that story has been told. That require a lot of international stories. So yes, some events are communicated much more easily, but there are a whole lot I think that require in-depth reporting that we don't often see being done.
So I'm going to use the privilege of the chair to tell a quick anecdote that before we get to questions. One of my earliest jobs when I was in my early 20s, I went off to Peru to work as a freelance journalist, and I got a job for the English language newspaper in Lima, Peru, which was appended to a business, English language publication for the business community, which covered politics, business, and everything else in English in Lima, Peru. And they charged a lot of money for it, and they got a lot of money for it. And the lesson that taught me was the rest of the press in Peru's very flawed political scene at that time was totally partisan, bought off, corrupt, everything else.
My mom is from Lima, and her cousin landed behind bars as
bought
off by.
Yes. So, and the point being that they needed foreigners to tell them what was actually going on, literally in another language. And people who really needed accurate, objective information would pay a high premium for it to get it from these outsiders, these people who weren't, who could, if push came to shove, could move to Chile, which in the end they had to do. And I sort of feel like if we might find ourselves needing something like that here in America, right? Like there might be like this niche, like
independent observers.
Yeah, right. The men and women from outside the maelstrom speaking in hopefully in English, but maybe not. Maybe they can use another language, German.
I think you're describing the Economist, Chuck.
Yeah, well, I might be, actually. So with that, I think we will open it up to questions. We're at, I think we're at about 6:11. Is that okay? Who's the boss of this? Guy? Are we okay on time?
Should be okay. Yeah.
We have until about 6:30?
Yes.
Okay. So you will be in control of the microphone?
Me and my associate over there, yes.
Oh, okay. There's your other associate. What's your name? Jehan. Okay, Jehan. Guy, why don't you go first with the woman in the back?
Hi. I think I might be perfect for an outsider perspective. I'm a college student doing my semester abroad here. My name is Nia. I'm at Georgetown University. And I want to say about colleges that there is plenty of nuance. And I just wish that media outlets would try to facilitate and involve college students more into those debates. And I think you will find a lot of nuance there. So as an outsider, to me, it seems that liberals and conservatives start from very, very different premises that have almost nothing to do. But like what I hear in college and what I hear here are completely opposite. But then once you get into a discussion, people have a lot to say, and it's very similar, very, very sound judgment. And I think I wish people would find that on a broader scale. So my question is, where is the overlap between the two sides, and how can it be uncovered more on a broader scale?
Thank you, Nia. Who wants to take that one on?
Eliana. The overlap in terms of ideology, in terms of policy, or?
Okay. Yeah, in terms of ideology, and what are some of the things that you can agree on, which maybe can be the start of a bigger agreement? Maybe in terms of ideology.
I mean, I risk sounding, again, like sentimental. I think there's a lot of overlap, actually. I mean, I think in many respects the media exaggerates the differences, and the kind of funhouse mirror of ideological splintered kind of publications that we present reflects back to Americans a lot of the time an image of themselves that doesn't comport with the nuance, to use the word you used, of their own lives. I think basically decent people who want the best for the country. You know, I would start there, you know, in looking for overlap. And also, if you ask the average person, they're like, of course I want a diversity of views. Of course I want to hear what the other side has to say. Now, when you're confronted with that, you feel differently, at least I do. It's hard. It's hard work. It's a very counterintuitive idea that you should hear, you know, a view that you find obnoxious. And in some ways, it's a more immediately kind of recognizable point of view that, oh, that idea is dangerous, I shouldn't have to hear it. I think that's actually a much more dangerous point of view in the long haul. But once you talk people through it, they're generally supportive of the principle. So I guess my view is, in general, I mean, you know, that there actually is a lot of overlap.
Jehan, I think we have a question over there.
Thank you. My name is Jacob. I'm from Sweden, so I'm a guest here in your country. And much of what you described, James, about media, the Times being a voice for their own readership of progressive values, kind of very much describes some of the newspapers, leading newspapers in my own country of Sweden, and also the rest of Europe. For example, a couple of years ago, when your former president talked about last night in Sweden, used that as a horrible example of criminality on the rise, plenty of newspapers wanted to go to school with him on how Sweden is safe, but at the same time, we have lots of criminality, new forms of clan-based violence, migration, tensions, and everything that comes with that. And that kind of speaks to what talked about as media being kind of the new priesthood, teaching people the right kind of values instead of reporting on what is actually happening. And I was wondering if you could speak more to the international trend, because this is, as I'm into trying to touch here, is that it's not just the New York Times, and it's not just here in the States, but it's also in Europe in the broader sense.
I can't claim to be an expert on the European media, but my sense is it has been ever thus, actually. There's been much more of the American journalistic tradition is a little bit odd in the emphasis that's been placed in mainstream institutions on this idea of objectivity with all its flaws. Every generation discovers that objectivity is a myth one way or another. That, let's just set that aside. But that in some ways, the European model has been more kind of openly ideological all the way along. I don't know if that I have that wrong. Thomas, you'd know more about that.
It's certainly more ideological in France, yeah.
Gentleman here.
Thanks. Leon, peace. The former president became well known for his criticism of the media, particularly with the phrase failing New York Times. Did that have any impact on the reporting or on the culture of the media?
I'm happy to take that. I was actually covering the White House at the time, and it was quite interesting. I think within the White House press corps, my sense was that the president's overt and sort of provocative attacks on the press gave the press, they felt, White House correspondents, people in the briefing room, they felt gave them license to take an opinion and take a stand because they felt under attack and they wanted to push back, and it was mutually beneficial. For Trump, you know, the right loves to hate the media, and it was, you know, it was a wonderful political talking point for him. For the press and for these guys in the briefing room, Jim Acosta and everybody else, they got enormously famous, more famous than they had been going in, standing up, talking about the threat they were under. How many books did we see come out from him and all these other people? Their time covering Trump, the courage they showed standing up to his bullying, this, that, and the other. So my sense was that like there was this mutually beneficial back and forth that was politically beneficial to Trump and financially and personally beneficial to the reporters, that gave them license to depart from the sort of objective stance that they may have come in with.
If I could take just a second to ask James about that, because I think a sort of a Rubicon was crossed when people started in the press to say the word, you know, so-and-so lied. It was very often Trump lied, but now we're pretty free about that generally. And I seem to recall a front page story in the Times by, I'm going to forget his name, where the news story sort of, you know, announced that we had to play by different rules under Trump.
I think, look, covering Trump is a real challenge. It's hard, you know, it is hard when somebody is such an unconventional politician, when he doesn't, he has, you know, we've obviously, all politicians bend the truth, but his total uninterest, how unmoored he was from fact, presented journalists with a real conundrum to simply report what he was saying. Now, you never, as a reporter, I mean, it's a bit of a false choice that I'm laying out there. As a reporter, you're not a stenographer. You always make clear when somebody isn't telling the truth. But it became, as Eliana said, more of like a cause to be able to say he lied, to use that very, very direct language. I think I know the Times really struggled with the question of when do you say lie, when do you not? And there were moments when they did, and I think they actually pulled back from that, as I recall, partly because that language is so loaded, and it short circuits the reader's ability to really think about it and reach their own conclusion. I think and I think that's a case where the Times rightly retreated from making such a clear kind of political statement about the president.
According to legend at the Washington Post, Carl Bernstein always wanted to be able to say in news stories, Nixon was guilty, like that phrase, and was restrained from doing that by his editors, headed by Ben Bradley, on the theory that, we'll let the jury decide that. But it shows kind of how, assuming that legend is true, and I think there's some truth to it, times have changed.
I mean, I really do think it comes down to is the role of the journalist to tell the reader what to think or to help the reader think for themselves. And obviously I'm in the latter camp, and I think that because that's what I think people want to do. They don't want to be led, but this has been this is an old struggle that we overcame in the 1920s, I think, but now we're back to, again, this 19th century model where we feel like we need to tell them what they think because we don't trust them to arrive at the right conclusions otherwise.
I think we have a question over here.
Hi, James. This has been very interesting. My name is Chris Isham, by the way. I come very much out of mainstream media. But my question is, you raised the issue of the business models. And it seems like the business model has increasingly favored the balkanization of the media. And that's really what we're looking at today, is a landscape now in which so many of the media outlets have slotted in to one point on the ideological spectrum. Is there a business model that you think can restore some kind of centrist position that can be more diverse of opinions, that can be more objective, or is that idea shot?
Anybody want to?
I feel like you know more.
The Economist is doing it, right?
Yes, although The Economist has, it takes strong positions on things and it has an editorial line. I think it's a super hard problem, Chris. I don't think it's an easy answer. I think the cable industry in a lot of ways led the way into this new kind of media reality that we're living with. And because you can build a pretty big business and a reliable business appealing to, a certain segment of the American public. You don't need 100 million people or 150 million people. And that's kind of the safe, to the extent any play has ever been safe in media, particularly now, that's kind of the safe play, is to occupy an ideological niche. I think it's possible. I mean, I think that there are publications out there that are successful journalistic and business enterprises that have this kind of integrity. I think the Wall Street Journal is actually a pretty good example right now in its news report. I think Politico is actually another example of a publication that does a very good job of covering the political. I don't know if you agree with me on this, Eliana. You work there. Does a good job of covering the political landscape and is succeeding as a business, not at massive scale, but is succeeding. I think it is doable, but it's not the safe. It's not the safe way. And look, the biggest problem, which we haven't talked about so much tonight, is just the wipeout of local journalism, which has deprived Americans of accountability journalism in their own community, but also a journalism that they can see and touch and believe in, that gives them some reason to, because they know whether or not they can see in their own community whether it's doing a good job of representing it.
And if I may say, provides the talent pipeline for the major media. Yeah.
And nobody's figured that one out yet. Like, that's a deep problem that we're.
I think this person right here in the front.
Thank you so much. My name is Vladislav Davidson. I'm a journalist, and also I'm Thomas's friend and neighbor. I'm in legacy. I'm not in legacy media, but I'm in journalism, and I find that so many of my colleagues in legacy media are so incredibly conformist, and I don't know why, but you know, you got into journalism because you like to travel, or you're interested in seeing the world, or you're curious. I got into journalism because I hate authority, and I'm here to cause trouble. And a lot of these people don't have that same troublemaking instinct and maybe pathology that I have that was intrinsic to journalists of that cranky generation 30 years ago saying, this is journalism, not advertising. I really like making problems for politicians. I really get off on that, and they don't. And I don't know why. And it's very easy to have a sort of contempt for their lack of contempt for the political class. And I always wonder, why don't they just join the political party? Why don't they just become activists for the Democratic Party instead of pretending they're journalists? I just don't understand. Maybe you'll explain to me. I'm new here.
That's a great comment. I do think there is part of what ails journalism is it has become a very respectable profession, and it didn't used to be. It used to be vaguely disreputable. You know, to be a newspaper reporter was sort of like just a cut above, I don't know, numbers runner, I blame Woodward and Bernstein for that, you know, for making everybody a movie star. And, well, Bernstein was more old school in that way, but Woodward was from Yale and Navy intelligence and everything. But anyway, I'll take that as more of a comment than a question. We have time for a couple more.
Thank you for this great conversation. So it seems that institutions that are interested in the pursuit of truth tend to be nonprofits, like universities, like think tanks. Should newspapers be nonprofits?
Well, we are, but not intentionally. That's a good question. Anybody want to take that?
I think that I've thought about how these things could potentially work better. I think the subscription model is really damaging because of audience capture, as already was discussed. Maybe there does have to be some type of government intervention and make it a nonprofit, but that actually seems like it would enrage large swaths of the country. You know, PBS is no longer trusted by a lot of the country, and it's considered, you know, to be associated with one party in the binary. So I find it hard to believe that, you know, if the government were to be, you know, invested in the paper of record, that would kind of ease tensions. I guess it seems to me, and I work at The Atlantic, so maybe I'm biased there, but it seems to me like you need benevolent oligarchs to kind of, you know, hopefully have the public's interest at heart and relieve you of the need to cater to an audience that captures your ability to objectively report on issues that might anger them.
One more question. Yes, over here.
Thanks, everybody. I'm an academic and there are cameras, so I'll leave my name out of it for now, maybe. But there seems to be a consensus that things aren't good among all the panelists. I wonder whether is it good that things have gotten so bad? And might it be better if things got even worse? Just for example, thinking about what went down at the Times, I regarded that with very mixed feelings at the time and after the fact as well. But overall, I was pleased, as you might not have been. And sorry, Adam, I know Adam's here. But that's because I see the problem we've been discussing, which I think at a certain point Charles put very nicely, is, you know, young people in particular are more concerned with changing the world than understanding it. It seems to me that the root of that problem lies in higher education, and it's very hard to package what goes on in the classroom, what goes on in faculty meetings, what goes on search committees, what goes on in academic journals in such a way that it can be consumed by the general public. So it remains largely under the surface, or it has for a very long time. But when the New York Times sort of sets a match to its credibility in public, this is very visible to everybody. And I think James at some point mentioned that a counter-revolution might be coming. But that can only come once the revolution is visible and visible enough to provoke a reaction. So my question for, I guess, everyone and maybe anyone who wants to take it up is this a good thing that things have gotten so bad, and might we hope that they get worse?
This sounds like a question Lenin might have asked. Who wants to take that one on? I bet Eliana would have a good answer to that.
I'm happy to offer some brief thoughts on this question and the one that preceded it, because I think they're related, and that the business model is a problem, I agree, but I actually don't believe that if newspapers became nonprofits, that would solve the problem, because I don't believe universities are engaged in the pursuit of truth right now. And that's part of the problem, and my sense is that, look, the problem starts in K through 12 schools. It's exacerbated then in colleges, and what's really the problem is that the training grounds of the country's elites are deeply deformed. And as a result, this is not just happening in journalism. Yes, it's happening in journalism, but it's also playing out in academia. It's playing out in the country's major corporations. BlackRock and some of the biggest financial corporations, hedge funds, whatever, all over the country. Google and AI. We're seeing this everywhere. And I do think, seeing the testimony of these 3 college presidents under the Klieg lights for the whole country to be able to see, these people are actually intellectually impoverished. And these are the people running some of the most elite institutions in this country that people fall all over them, so they bribe people to get their children into. That is eye-opening, and I do think will have salutary benefits. And certainly for me, I grew up, without getting too personal, but in a household where it was highly valued to go to an Ivy League school, and I have no desire to fall all over myself to get my kid into such an institution, because I don't think there's a lot of valuable things going on. And the training grounds for our elites, what we teach our elites, what we teach young people to value, that needs to change. And before that changes, whoever goes to work at the New York Times, people we're going to hire into the New York Times or the Post or the Journal, it's not going to change. People are everything.
Well, I'm going to once again exercise the privilege of the chair to conclude on the following note. I'm going to go back to my early years in Peru with another anecdote. The guy who ran this operation was from Britain. He was a Fleet Streeter of the old school. And he gave me my first big assignment, which was to write about how the impact of crime and terrorism was affecting the business community around Lima. It was a big issue at the time. So he sat me down, and I was, I admit it, I was newly minted from Harvard, and I'd been an intern at the New Republic. I was very full of myself. And he said, how would you approach this story? And he said, what do you think people want to know? And I proceeded to give him just the sort of bloviating answer you would have expected from a person like that. I went on for a good 15 minutes. And he looked at me and he said, no. People want to know what's going on, And that has stayed with me throughout my entire career. That's what people want to know. People want to know what's going on. And they want to be able to rely on the person who is communicating to them what's going on. They don't want to know kind of my deep feelings about this, that, and the other thing. People want to know what's going on. And I sort of feel like more journalism needs to take that approach, which is a roundabout way of saying, I think we all found out what's going on from this panel, which I sure learned a lot from, and I think it's just been a very illuminating afternoon. So let's give them a big hand.